Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Elements of Sustainability series. Today, we are happy to have Dr. Ravi Anupindi from the University of Michigan. Dr. Anupindi is going to discuss about responsible operations and supply chain management. This is a very relevant topic as all of us are part of the extended value chain of the products and services we produce and purchase. Therefore, we all can have a role to play to ensure its responsible management. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Ravi. He is a professor of operations research and management at the Ross School of Business, and he's also the founding faculty director of the Center for Value Chain Innovation. His main research areas include technology and business innovation, supply chain management, strategic sourcing, lean operations, supply chain sustainability, value chain for economic development and healthcare delivery in low and middle income countries. He serves on the board of the William Davidson Institute and has a technical advisor to Vital Ocean. Welcome, Dr. Anupindi. It is great to have you to start this year's program.
Thank you, Erica. Really appreciate that kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I also want to thank the Dow Chemical Company for giving me this opportunity to discuss some ideas on responsible operations and supply chain management. I also want to acknowledge the Urban Institute for facilitating this opportunity. One other thing that I want to add before I get in to the discussion is that I also chair an advisory committee to our president, the university president, on labor standards and human rights. And that allows me another perspective on social responsibility issues in global supply chain management. So let's start. Broadly, the outline for today's discussion would be I'll give you some brief introduction around why supply chains are important, and Erica, you highlighted that as well. And then we'll get into sustainability issues in operations and supply chain management, looking at it from within firm, upstream supply chains, as well as downstream supply chains. Most of that discussion will largely center around environmental issues in supply chain, and therefore I want to kind of set aside towards the end to talk, in addition, about social responsibility issues in supply chains, and then we will conclude this discussion. So why are supply chains important? Here is a pie chart that shows the sectors of the US economy that contribute to the overall GDP. And what I've highlighted here, if you look at the four sectors of manufacturing, transport, wholesale trade, and retail trade, constitute about 40% of the economy. So 40% of the economy is about making, moving, and selling products. That's the core of the supply chain. But it's more than that, because almost every supply chain, if you move it upstream into the source, almost all supply chains end up in Mother Nature, either on top of a tree or on the ground, above the ground, under the ocean, wherever. So, which means if we extended supply chains include agricultural, forestry, fishing, mining, etc., that leaves a fairly large chunk of the economy, almost 50%, that is in the financial services sector, general services sector, as well as the government sector. But I would argue that any service organization also, to provide the service that they have to give, actually are sitting at one end of a humongous supply chain where they buy products, they buy assets, they buy supplies to be able to provide the services that they do provide. So effectively, the entire economy is run through a supply chain, and people have talked about supply chain as the central circulatory system of the global economy. So it's a very important stuff, and therefore, when we think in terms of sustainability, we have to talk about supply chain, and that's the context that I want to bring to you today. Most of the stuff actually that we buy comes to us from some other country. In fact, if you look at some of these statistics that I'm showing you on this picture, from 40% of washing machines, 50% of cement textiles, buttons, shoes, color televisions, toys, lights, and batteries, everything comes to us from somewhere else. Now, while we enjoy these products in our homes or in our offices, the supply chain that produces these products actually leaves a very stark trail behind. So, for example, this is the impact on the environment of the production systems of these global supply chains that bring the products to us, which has obviously impact on the planet. The impact is not just on the planet, as we can see, the impact is also on people who produce these products, whether it is in the textile sector. What we see in the first two pictures is, you may have heard about the building collapse in Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh. In the ready-made garment sector, you have mining, a lot of labor violation issues in mining, child labor issues in cotton farming. You have deforestation issues that impact animals as well, and food supply chains obviously have a lot of impact on animals. So what I'm basically getting at is, upstream in the supply chain, there are really very dramatic consequences of how these systems are set up on the planet, on the people, and all the animals. Unfortunately, these impacts don't just end there. Even after we have consumed the products, we begin to impact the planet in terms of what comes out post-consumption, in terms of either garbage, in terms of packaging, in terms of electronic waste, in terms of plastics. We pollute the ocean, we pollute the earth. So this is quite a big impact on the earth that we have. In fact, if you've followed the recent news, the last picture that I'm showing you here is of a sperm whale that was found dead. And when they cut it open, there was hundreds of pounds of plastic inside the sperm whale's belly. So this is really quite tragic in terms of the impacts that these global supply chains leave behind and our consumption patterns leave behind on the earth. If you take a footprint perspective, from just, let's say, from only an emissions perspective, here is kind of a segmentation of different sectors of the economy that contribute to the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now I'm kind of narrowing this down to only greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a lot of statistics here, but effectively what we are saying here is, at the current levels of global production and consumption, we are using 50% more natural resources and services than the ecosystem can actually generate. So which means this one planet is not enough for us. So this statistic from a footprint perspective is talking about both supply side as well as consumption side. I'm not going to touch upon the consumption part of the equation in this presentation, but focus and delve a little bit more detail into the supply side of the equation. So with that brief introduction, let's get into the operations and supply chain aspects of it. Before I address sustainability issue, I just want to briefly kind of talk about how I think about operations. To me, operations management is really about processes. Anywhere work gets done, there is a process to do it. So what's the process? In a process, you take inputs, you use resources, whether it's labor or capital or capital, and you take these inputs, you transform those inputs to create some outputs. Output could be goods or services. It's a very, very generic definition of what a process is, and how to manage these inputs, how to manage the resources, how to manage the transformation process to create desired goods and services is what operations management is all about. Now, at this level, it's a very generic kind of framing. Anywhere, as I said, anywhere work gets done, we can apply this idea, and that's the power of this simple framing of what is operations management. Now, one of the most important concepts in operations management is that of lean operations. Lean operations originated from the Toyota production system and basically came to us in the 70s timeframe. Lean is, at a philosophical level, lean is about reducing waste. So waste can occur in many different ways. In any process, there could be waste. It could be what I'm showing here is there could be waste in terms of moving products, or waste in transport, waste in inventory when you create more inventory, waste of motion, of people moving around unnecessarily, waste of waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, defects, etc. There are lots of detailed methods about how to address these waste situations. But if you take a moment and think about, if the core idea of lean is elimination of waste, there should be some parallel connection between that idea in lean of eliminating waste with the notion of sustainability. After all, if waste is being created, which is unnecessary, there must be some footprint impacts of that waste. And surely enough, there is, and I can walk you through a few examples of this, not exhaustive. So if you think in terms of defects as a waste, what is a defect? It's a scrap, Either you have to scrap the product that you just produced, you may have to rework it, you may have to replace it, etc., etc. But the environmental impacts of that are pretty obvious, because if you have to scrap the product, the raw material that you used to create the product is also gone. If you have to rework, there's more energy taken, more work needed. It may have to be recycled, it may have to be disposed. To do all this extra work that is not necessarily leading to a good product, you also need more space, and that more space needs more energy used for heating, cooling, lighting, whatever else is required. So you can see these environmental connections to this particular type of waste of defects. Similarly, if you take movement, movement could be both transportation as well as human movement. If you're moving unnecessarily, obviously you're using up energy for the use of that transport. There is emissions from that transport. Similarly, if you create inventory, which is not necessary at the time, so it is excess raw material or excess work in process or excess finished goods that you're basically getting at, then obviously you need more space to store that inventory. That space has to be kept in appropriate temperature, has to be lighted appropriately. There's energy consumption behind it. And some of this inventory probably needs some packaging, and that packaging, if it is excess inventory that will be disposed of later, then that packaging is unnecessary. So there is a parallel between ideas in lean, the concept of waste reduction, and environmental impacts. So that seems a straightforward connection. And in fact, it should not be surprising to see that this connection, recall I showed you this process view. It's like taking the process view and putting on a different set of lenses on this. And if I put an environmental lens to this stuff, I can think in terms of, oh, inputs is not just about some raw material or information coming in. I need energy. Nature provides input, so the way I exploit nature is an issue. In terms of outputs, it's not just about goods and services that I created, but the impacts that I leave behind on the planet, people, and community. So it's really like taking this process view, the classical process view, but looking at it from a very different lens, which is the environmental lens, and you suddenly begin to see things that you couldn't see before, and those also could have waste elements in it, and waste reduction then becomes at least synergistic with reducing sustainability impacts. And many companies have actually seen that. So people have talked about being green as a byproduct of efficiency. So here are 4 examples, though a little bit dated. The first 2, Johnson & Johnson and Heineken, what we see here are gaining a lot of improved energy efficiency improvement through energy reduction through efficiency initiatives. And the next 2 examples of Nestle and Walmart are basically talking about packaging reduction and how much reduction they're getting in through packaging. So all these examples seem to suggest that a company can have it all. That is, I can improve efficiency, which is a cost reduction argument, and also get sustainability improvement. So seems like there's no trade-off, right? So what's going on? People have talked a lot about, oh, if I have to do sustainability, it has to come, it will cost me more. So how do we square this idea of that I can get both efficiency improvement and sustainability improvement? How do we try to understand that stuff? Because there are a lot of people who will say, well, that can't be true, right? So one way to think about this is, I use this phrase called, is sustainability free? Because for those of you who remember the quality movement from a couple of decades ago, there were a lot of quality gurus who talked about the notion of quality is free. Well, how can quality be free if I'm going to give better quality product? It has to cost me more. Similarly, if I have to build do some sustainability initiatives, it has to cost me more. And that's not true if you take this perspective. What I'm showing you here is this concept of an efficient frontier. Let me take a moment to explain what this is. You see a lot of these different crosses on this chart as different firms that I plot on 2 axes. Let's say the x-axis, we take one particular metric for sustainability, let's say emissions. Multiple dimensions could be there, but let's take emissions. So on the x-axis, I plot emissions. On the y-axis, I plot the cost. So what each data point here represents is different firms that are at different levels of emissions and cost structure. So, this is the data. I plot this stuff. Then I look at all the companies and draw this kind of a curve, which I would call the efficient frontier, which means for a given level of emissions, they are the least cost operation, the least cost firm. So, as an example, if you take firm A has a higher emission level, but a cost level that is lower. And there is, at this emission level, there is no other firm that has a lower cost structure than firm A. Similarly, firm B is a lower emitting company, had a slightly higher cost structure, but at its level of emission, there is no other company that has a lower cost structure. So you take all those companies that form this efficient frontier, and then what you see is there will be many companies who are above this efficient frontier. So what's the implication of being on the efficient frontier? But let's back up a little bit and talk about if company A wants to reduce its emission, it has to move up the efficient frontier. And let's say company A wants to become like company B with lower emissions, its cost will go up. So for those companies that are on the efficient frontier, there is truly a trade-off between sustainability and cost. But not all companies are on the efficient frontier. So let's take an example. Let's say a company C. A company C is above the efficient frontier. Now, every company would like to move to an efficient frontier. What could it do? There are at least a couple of pathways, more than two pathways, but I'll illustrate two. So one is it could move squarely to the left on the efficient frontier. When it moves squarely to the left on the efficient frontier, what you're able to do is keep the same cost structure and reduce emissions. Or it could go slightly down and reduce the cost structure and reduce emissions, which means it's getting both. So the story, the example that I gave you before, and using taking a sustainability lens and viewing operations is and identifying opportunities for both efficiency improvement and sustainability impact improvement basically is happening because many firms are not on the efficient frontier and they're able to get both benefits as they make this improvement. So that's kind of the logic and how to explain that we can get both improvements at the same time. Since we talked about quality, I also believe that sustainability should, one way to think about sustainability is what the entire industry went through in the quality movement. There were days when people talked about quality. I'm talking about, maybe 3-4 decades ago. But quality is the responsibility of the quality department, as if they're looking for, good quality products, inspecting them out, and then doing that stuff. But then people like Deming came along and said, no, that's not how we think about quality. Quality is really about organizational and technological innovations, and quality has to be embedded within the firm. So this embedding idea within the firm is what truly helps company deliver quality. So I believe sustainability needs to be viewed similarly as it makes its progress into the firm. That is, think of sustainability as more organizational technological innovations. Think of sustainability as being embedded within the firm's DNA. In fact, very similar arguments have been made by an article that our own professor, late C.K. Prahalad, wrote in HBR, and he uses very similar phrases. He says, their research shows that sustainability is a mother lode of organizational and technological innovations that yield both bottom line and top line returns. So this is where sustainability has to go. That is, sustainability has to get embedded within the business. And when I say within the business, from our perspective, within how operations and supply chain actually is done. Before I transition into getting into some details on sustainability, supply chain, etc. details, I would really like to also highlight one other aspect. I'm sure there have been other talks in this series where people have tried to define what's the multidimensionality of sustainability, etc. We can all come to some ways of measuring sustainability, whether it's emissions, some footprint, etc. To me, in the end, those sets of metrics are simply as an artifact about we can say, well, we are sustainable or we are sustainable at this level. What it doesn't answer, especially in a globally dispersed supply chain, that the other notion we have to talk about is responsibility. So whose responsibility is it to ensure sustainability? I think that sometimes gets missed. it's not enough to talk about sustainability. We have to talk about the responsibility piece. Is it my responsibility as an anchor firm? Is it my supplier's responsibility, or is it my supplier's supplier responsibility, or is it the customer's responsibility? I think that responsibility chain also has to be brought into the discussion. So with that introduction, I would like to go into talking about sustainability issues within firm, upstream and downstream ideas. But before a firm really begins to think about its sustainability of operations and supply chain, we have to go back to obviously strategy. Now, this is not a session on strategy, but I need to kind of frame this before I go into the operations supply chain aspects of it. So there are many frameworks available, and again, I'm not going to discuss these frameworks. You can look it up. These frameworks really help a company think through how it should set up its sustainability strategy, because there are many, many issues to think about. Should I worry about water? Should I worry about human rights? Should I worry about emissions? How should I think about all this stuff? And so some of the frameworks available are natural steps, sustainability hierarchy. I think there's been one talk on triple bottom line. The way I think about triple bottom line is really trying to providing a decision-making framework to make trade-offs between social, economic, and environmental issues. So we need to use whatever frameworks are available to kind of think through how a company will develop its sustainability strategy. Beyond frameworks, I think one other point I would like to make is regardless of which process one goes through, in the end, one should develop some notion of a portfolio approach, because that balances things out. And two aspects of this portfolio that I would like to highlight. One is that we shouldn't simply take a utilitarian perspective. What I mean by utilitarian perspective is, somehow I could trade off between social and environmental and economic. So for example, triple bottom line allows you to do that. It's a useful framework, but that's not the only way we need to think about this. That has to be balanced against a justice approach, which means what's the right thing to do? And we need to then figure out how to get that right thing done. But in some situations, what's the right thing to do is very important, and not everything can be boiled down to a utilitarian framework. The other point I want to make when you take about portfolio approach is the short-term versus long-term. There is a lot of sustainability issues, or some of the sustainability issues are really long-term games, and we need to think through as we develop this portfolio how to kind of blend both short-term and long-term issues in our strategy development itself. Of course, the strategy development has to take into account the perspectives of different stakeholders. So a stakeholder mapping approach needs to be done. Who are the different stakeholders, and what are their demands? And beyond the obvious, you have your workers, your suppliers, your customers. There's investor community. How do the investor community kind of think about this? Then there is the activist community. They are not your direct stakeholders, but they could influence what you are forced to do in some ways, or reprioritize. So these need to be all taken into account and need to be tailored to, your strategy needs to be tailored to these demands, and also match that with what capability you have, a capability assessment of what capabilities do you have internally, and for what capabilities do we have to go outside to be able to implement the strategy. Next step would be, of course, you have to come up with some metrics. How would you measure any of this stuff? 4 ideas within the metrics. Once you have the metrics identified, how do you do an assessment, which is setting the baseline, setting a target. And there's lots of debates on how targets should be set. Should it be absolute targets, relative targets, science-based targets? There's lots of research going on in that. And then 2 other notions that are very important in your sustainability journey would be disclosure and transparency. I think I'll touch upon this a little bit later as well. I think transparency is very, very important when it comes to your sustainability journey. So with that kind of strategy setting, one does have to, is a question that is often asked is, how can sustainability create value? So this is again back to utilitarian framework, and we cannot ignore that. So I will posit that there are at least 2 different ways, and of course there are 3. One is risk management. So that might be the first approach people take, because there's regulatory pressure, there is a reputation management that I have to do. There could be simply operational risk. My ability to continue to do business could be impacted because of some sustainability issues, shortage of raw materials, or climate change impacting my supply chain, etc. So there's a risk perspective. there's a return on capital perspective. That is, how can I bring efficiencies in both my operations and supply chain that gives me better return on capital. So clearly there is value one can derive from doing sustainability initiatives, but it needs a little bit of a thought to kind of articulate that. So this is another kind of thing to be added to your strategy setting session. Now, let's get into the operations and supply chain aspect of it. The way I think about supply chain, basically abstract away, supply chain to me is really 4 activities that any firm engages in, right? You buy something, you make something, you move it, that is the distribution piece, and you sell it. So this buy, make, move, sell are the 4 kind of broad stages of a supply chain. In this slide, I'm showing you a dotted line approach, a dotted line from design, because I also believe that product design impacts the supply chain performance as well. But it's not important to focus on that for the purpose of this discussion. Buy, make, move, sell are the 4 important stages in a supply chain. So if we take this and now apply a sustainability lens to it, how do we think about this? I normally think in terms of bucketing it in 3 segments. One is within firm sustainability, that is within my own firm boundaries. Let's say I'm doing a production, I'm doing distribution and selling. What are sustainability issues within the firm boundaries? What can I do to on the sustainability side within the firm? So that's one piece of it. And we'll go through each one of these in stepwise fashion. Then there is on the supply end of things. Now, supply end of thing is not just your immediate suppliers. I'm basically thinking about the entire upstream supply chain. So I'll call that the upstream end of the supply chain and the sustainability in the upstream supply chain. Now, the third piece is really that we are living in a world where selling does not, just because I sold the product, it doesn't end there, because there's lots of initiatives around returns, recycle, remanufacturing, etc. So there is a post-consumer or post-customer end of the supply chain as well that closes the loop for us. So I'll just call that the downstream end of the supply chain. So basically what we're talking about is we will look at supply chain from, and segment this into 3 buckets. Within the firm, what do I do? Upstream, what do I do? And then downstream, what do I do from it? And what are some of the issues in supply chain sustainability that come up? So let's take this one step at a time. Within the firm, potential focus areas could be, again, just recap, this is about production, distribution, and perhaps retailing as well. So how do you enable cleaner manufacturing and warehouse and retail operations? So this could be simply an energy efficiency issue. What is the source of energy that you use for your manufacturing, for your building, distribution centers, etc., etc. So how do you enable cleaner manufacturing and warehouse operations? Then, of course, there's movement in this supply in this part of the chain as well. So how can you lower emissions in transit? Lowering emissions in transit is a function of perhaps technology. You could use electric vehicles and lower emissions. It could also be impacted by the mode of transport. There is research to suggest, for example. So what I'm showing you here is the different modes of transport have different carbon footprints. Air, for example, has the highest carbon footprint. Rail is the shortest carbon footprint, smallest carbon footprint. But there are trade-offs, obviously. Rail will take much longer than air. So, but there are some choices. To the extent that I can make those choices by shifting the mode of transport, I could impact emissions in transit. And by the way, transport is actually a huge segment of the economy. It's about 6% of US GDP, so it could have a substantial impact. Staying on transport, there are a few other issues we could do. We could reduce transit distances, which means why is my warehouse so far away, or why is my manufacturing plant so far away? Could I move closer to my customer, or could I move closer to my supplier? By doing so, I could reduce transit distances, and by reducing distance, I could reduce the impact of emissions in transit. But that requires a supply chain redesign, if you will. I could also think in terms of consolidating, items that move. Instead of moving 2 half trucks, between 2 locations, I could consolidate the load and move only once. That will obviously reduce my emissions, etc. So there are many things you could do in terms of energy consumption and transport in your, in moving that could impact sustainability. 2 other ideas we can think about in this space would be I could reuse the assets, and this is the closed loop piece of the equation. That is, when material moves between 2 locations, instead of moving in a disposable packaging, it could be moved in an asset that can be used, whether it's a pallet or it is a container, etc., that kind of recycles through the system. So that's one way to kind of get some sustainability improvement. Any production system might create a byproduct, a waste. If the byproduct is useful, that's great. But if it is generally thrown away today, maybe I could be creative about how I take, the waste that I have, and maybe somebody else can take that as input. Similarly, if I have certain raw material input that I need, maybe that could be a source of somebody's customer for somebody else's waste. So there are many ways creative ways to think about it, is waste management and taking waste input to create some new products. So these are some ways we can think about this. And finally, these are all environmental issues I've talked about. There could be labor standards and human rights issues in production systems as well as in distribution systems. And there's these days a lot of talk about the labor conditions in warehousing operations, because as warehousing e-commerce grows, warehousing is growing. But similarly, there could be a lot of labor issues in manufacturing as well. So these are some things to think about within the firm boundaries. If you move a little bit upstream in the supply chain, we need to start thinking about, what comes to us. In fact, many firms have argued that more than 80% of their environmental footprint actually is in the upstream end of the supply chain, not within their firm boundaries. So therefore, upstream supply chain does take a very important role, or is an important area to impact when we think of sustainability. But to be able to impact the upstream and supply chain, I need to think about, again, a very strategic approach to this stuff. So for example, this is the picture I'm showing you here is Walmart's original approach to looking at sustainability. As you can see, they boil it down to 3 buckets. Energy and waste. Energy and waste are obviously internal to their operations. Then they go into what is called sustainable products. So if in the framing that I have given, energy and waste could be within firm kind of issues, and then sustainable products is upstream supply chain issues. Obviously, a company like Walmart buys lots of different products and lots of different categories. So you need to kind of be strategic about, okay, which categories, and Walmart calls these value networks, whether it's textile, electronics, food and ag. So you need to kind of think through, identify what are the critical value networks to focus on here. So many different approaches one could use to think about what is critical for you. Generally, people think in terms of, either dollar volume of product movement and the potential hotspots or risk areas, both from an environmental or social perspective, where they should focus attention. So, but that process you have to go through that process to identify what those critical value networks are. Once you have done that, you also have to recognize as a firm, many firms have to recognize that sustainability in these value networks could be fairly complex tasks. So you can't do all this alone. So you have to build cross-sector partnerships. How do you kind of engage the supplier in thinking about sustainability? How do you engage the NGO sector? How do you engage academic input into this stuff? So build those things to clearly identify what are some core critical issues that need to be addressed in the value networks that I've identified. Once you have done that, you have to lay that out into a portfolio, and in the sense that what are some quick things that I could get, wins, what I call quick wins, quick sustainability wins you could get. Some could be a longer time frame, and some is a game changer. So another way to think about this is really on the timeline perspective. I need to think in terms of near-term wins, medium-term wins, and long-term kind of issues. So that's kind of a systematic approach to look at in getting into addressing issues in upstream supply chains. But once I've done that for any value network, here is some kind of thoughts to kind of think about. What are some factors that determine success of achieving sustainability in these upstream value networks? So I'll identify, this is not an exhaustive list, I identify a few factors. Clearly, as long as there is alignment between environmental and economic benefits for all the stakeholders involved, your firm, the suppliers, and customers, it's a no-brainer. I think it's going to be easier to get everybody on board to be able to adopt the sustainability initiative here. Industry structure matters. So imagine you are a firm and your supplier is at least as big as you are, and there are not that many suppliers out there. So then the issue becomes, well, how do you influence your supplier who's fairly large? how do they think about sustainability? So it's not that straightforward. So that industry structure will matter, as opposed to, let's suppose you have a very fragmented and very competitive industry supply base. If it's a very competitive supply base, then you could use sustainability as a criteria to weed people out and say, I'll only do business with those who align with my sustainability agenda. So industry structure would matter, and one has to pay attention to that. I would also argue that the product architecture matters. What I mean by product architecture is because product architecture influences the supply chain structure. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about highly assembled product like television or an automotive, there are many, many, many suppliers coming in. So if you think about sustainability, how do you even define sustainability attributes on that product or on that upstream supply chain? There's so much complexity exists upstream in the supply chain. As opposed to a highly assembled product, imagine, let's say, seafood. I mean, there is a seafood that is a fish that is caught, and it's really, more or less linear flow of that fish through the supply chain. It's easier to kind of think through, easier to map that supply chain, easier to identify what the sustainability attributes might be. So I'm not saying that, it's just to identify where the difficulty might be, and identifying the difficulty of achieving sustainability versus the product characteristics, the industry characteristics, etc. Another thing that matters is existence of credible and verifiable eco-labels, because just a firm announcing itself that this is I'm doing something eco-friendly is not enough. Somebody else has to, an independent verification and credible label has to exist to say this is what is being done. So I think existence of credible and verifiable eco-label is very useful because you could follow those practices that are standard. It's not just you doing it alone. Other people are doing it, and other people also have to follow those standards. Hand in hand with that is, as I was mentioning, you have to develop the partnerships. The existence of civil society organizations, CSO stands for civil society organizations, support for knowledge, capability, and credibility is extremely important. There's a gap there. Either you have to build all that internally, or you have to outsource and rely on NGO or the civil society community. And sometimes when you work with suppliers, they would trust the civil society more than they would trust you as a buyer if you are asking them to do certain things. So something to think about in terms of, in the value networks that you want to engage, how much of are there such organizations that can offer knowledge, capability, and credibility to work with the supply base? You also have to rethink about your supplier engagement strategies. No longer is it useful to kind of think in terms of arm's length relationship itself. If you really want to achieve sustainability in the supply chain, you have to move from an arm's length relationship to better engaging with your supplier. And that's very, very important. And corollary to that would be, as you better engage, you have to build deeper relationships with your supply base. And the relationship building could also mean you should be willing to share the risk, mitigate the risk, because many times the supplier has to take certain actions to embed sustainability in their operations, but that comes at a cost, and therefore, how much of that cost or risk are you as a buyer willing to bear? So again, these are not exhaustive lists, but these are directional kind of things about what you should think about as you begin to work upstream in your supply chain to embed sustainability. I would like to transition now to the third element, which is the downstream post-consumer end of the supply chain. The best way to illustrate this is to walk you through an example, let's say in your own household setting. I'll take the example of beverage cartons. What I'm showing you here is whether you buy milk, juice, or anything else in these cartons. There is a forward end of the supply chain. So typically a brand takes the product, buys the packaging, is making a choice on the packaging, and puts the product in that packaging and sells it to the retailer. You and I as a consumer go to the retailer and buy that product. Once we have consumed the product, we have the packaging, empty package. How do I decide what to do with this? Typically in most households, you'll have two choices. Should I put it in the recycling bin or should I put it in the garbage bin? Well, how do I decide that? Because my city tells me with a label that is put on the garbage bin saying, this recycling bin will accept these kinds of items and will not accept these kinds of items. So which means I have a choice, but the choice is influenced by what the city tells me. How does the city decide what to tell its consumers? Well, we have to follow that path to see where does the stuff that you put in the recycling bin actually go. It goes to what is called a material recovery facility, typically operated by a waste management company. And the material recovery facility is also a business on its own. And they tell the city, because there's a contract between the material recovery facility and the city, there's a contract that this company, the waste management company, tells the city, I will accept these items in the recycling bin. I will not accept these items in the recycling bin. So what you begin to see is that what you're told to put in the recycling bin is really is a business decision that is being made by the waste management company and telling its city. It has nothing to do with the inherent properties of the packaging. The packaging could be recyclable. Technology exists to recycle it, but yet in your community, your city may tell you that no, I cannot accept this in the recycling bin. That doesn't mean that the packaging cannot be recycled. It's just that it is not being recycled in your community because your waste management company does not accept the stuff. Why would a waste management company not accept some of these packaging? Because they have to find a business and they sort all these recycled materials between glass, paper, etc., and they try to sell it in the end market to somebody else. So if there is no market for the recycled packaging, then the waste management company is not going to accept it. So hopefully it gives you a sense that this reverse supply chain, really, the way it is run, is a business decision that different people are making, and that influences whether you have access to recycling or not. So recyclability is not an inherent, a material could be recyclable and yet not being recycled. So what are some of the core issues in this reverse supply chain? What you see here is it depends on what the recycling infrastructure looks like. Does that recycling infrastructure actually give you access? As I just pointed out, the access decision is really a business decision that organizations are making. Even if you had access, there is a behavioral issue on the consumer side. Do you actually put that packaging in the recycling bin, or do you just put it in the garbage bin, right? So that's a recovery issue. Most of these reverse supply chains are very fragmented. As I was showing you in the previous example, many different handoffs happening, many different types of actors come in, and it results in sometimes lack of efficiency. And often there is a market failure. In fact, we did a case study on the carton recycling. That's why I gave you the example of carton recycling, that cartons were not being recycled. And it was not because, not recycled in the United States, not because it cannot be recycled, it can be. It's just that people have made a business decision in the United States not to do so. There was not enough supply, there was not enough demand, and there was a market failure. Whereas rest of Europe recycles cartons, many parts of Asia recycles cartons. So that's what I mean by market failure. So a deep understanding of the reverse supply chain, who are the actors, how it works, what are the failures, is extremely important to think in terms of, when we think in terms of post-consumer supply chains. What is the trigger, typical triggers for post-consumer supply chains? Often it is because of regulation. In Europe, there is many types of regulation around producer responsibility, putting the onus on the producer to ensure that recycling will happen, because somebody's got to pay for this stuff. Either we have to pay as taxpayers, and the city picks up the tab, and they're compensated by taxpayer money, or as this is becoming more and more complex, maybe the producer should be held responsible for this, and those are typically driven by regulation. But many countries and many product categories, there is no regulation. So the other trigger could be simply voluntary action. The example I gave about carton recycling in the United States, this was the entire carton production industry, which includes likes of Tetra Pak, came together as an industry group, formed a Carton Council of North America, and systematically went and tried to rebuild the reverse supply chain, working with the waste management companies, working with the cities and municipalities to improve the access to recycling of communities within the United States. And they've done a fantastic job about this stuff. We've done also a project and on an initiative that Dell has been doing. Dell made some voluntary commitment to address the ocean plastic problem. And they have built an Asia-centric supply chain to take plastics and convert them into packaging material. No regulations exist in this space. It's just that companies voluntarily are taking these up on their own and trying to rebuild the supply chain. It's not an easy job. It's a very, very complex undertaking, but it is addressing the post-consumer part of the supply chain. So those are some highlights of the upstream, downstream, and within firm issues in supply chain. Most of the discussion is primarily focused on environmental issues. I would like to basically take a few minutes to talk about social responsibility issues in global supply chains. This is particularly dear to me. As I mentioned, I chair an advisory committee to our president on labor standards and human rights. Anything that gets the Michigan logo, we care about the conditions under which these products are being produced. So what do we mean here? I mean, in most of the global supply chains, the production systems extend into low and middle income countries. And we see a lot of labor standards and human rights violations in these kinds of settings. The pie chart, for example, here, based on some of the studies we have done, shows that the classic problems become compensation pay issue, hours worked, abuse and harassment in the workplace, health and safety issues, freedom of association, collective bargaining issues come up. So these are many different types of issues that come up in the supply chain. What has been historically the industry response for this stuff? The industry response basically has been there is one, what I would call a dominant mode or dominant logic, how they have addressed this issue, which is really the compliance model. What is a compliance model? You take some labor standards and human rights kind of issues, perhaps identified by the International Labor Organization, ILO standards. You take some subset of the ILO standards and embed that in what is typically a code of conduct. So you write a code of conduct of your firm. You expect your suppliers to sign this piece of paper, but of course you don't trust the supplier that they will follow through, and therefore you monitor them. And you find some issues, then you ask them to fix it, which is the enforcement piece. If they don't fix it, then you probably do take your business somewhere else. So standards, monitoring, and enforcement is kind of the three elements of what is a compliance model. But that gives the sense that it is like, I'm the police, you're the thief. If I catch you doing wrong, I'll punish you, right? So that's the model that's been going on for the last 20 years. And unfortunately, even with these 20 years, we have made some progress, but not much. You continue to see these reports. These are latest reports in the last 2 or 3 years that have come out. Stealing from the poor, in Haiti, crackdown in Cambodia, Vietnam issues. So there is, routinely these issues come up, and it come through my inbox, and I see many of these reports coming through. And then, if you follow this, beyond that, the huge impacts on building and fire safety. We saw the disastrous events in Bangladesh around this stuff. So you begin to question what's really going on. Very slow progress over the last 2 decades. And I would argue that you cannot simply police your way out towards responsibility in this setting. So the question really is there an alternative? And that alternative requires really rethink on the part of the firm and its upstream supply chain. What could that look like? And I would offer some ideas here, and then we'll close. As a firm, you have to begin to know your value chain end to end. How far does it extend? Who are these players? Who are the different stakeholders in the supply chain? And I say stakeholders, not just the factories, but the workers, the government entities, the civil society. You have to really, really understand the entire stakeholder map. You also have to ultimately understand how the workers perceive the different stakeholders. Just because the regulation exists in a country doesn't mean anything. How do the workers perceive those? How do the workers perceive the unions? And ultimately, the idea is you have to begin to understand the life of the worker. How are they leading their day-to-day life? What are the issues that they have in mind? A code of conduct typically is a top-down approach, whereas a worker-driven approach has to be embraced in this case. The second step, internally within your organization, you have to think about, beware of the gaps in decision-making constructs within your organization. And this is what I mean by that sustainability has to be embedded within your organizational DNA. We ask employees, or we set goals, we set incentives, but there are, and people try to follow as best as they can to achieve those goals. But there are unintended consequences sometimes of what they do. Do they understand the unintended consequences of what they're trying to do, even though they're meeting the goals and meeting the incentives structure? So it's very important to identify those gaps and sensitize the employees to those gaps. And another aspect there is that, oh, we shouldn't say we did the right thing, but my supplier actually didn't do the right thing. Well, we have to ask the question, why was the supplier not able to do the right thing? Is it because the supplier is a bad actor, or is it because of something that I asked the supplier to do and made it so unreasonable that they had no choice but to actually break the rules? So there are unintended consequences like this of what you choose to do, which means you also have to think about, when you are looking at decision making in your organization, not just focus on outcomes, but what is the decision making process the people are using that's equally important, not just the outcome. So these are some of the gaps that you have to kind of pay close attention to in how you set up your incentive structure, etc. Then you have to align decision making within the firm. So I need to elaborate this a little bit more. What I mean by is that, as you do business with your supply base, almost every company that I know has a supplier scorecard. But those supplier scorecards typically have standard performance measures like delivery, timeliness, quality, etc. Beyond those operational performance metrics, we have to begin to integrate social and environmental responsibility metrics in that scorecard. If we don't do that, that's where the rubber meets the road, where sustainability is integrated with business performance or sourcing. So that's on the sourcing end of things. But there is a planning issue too, because when you place orders with your supplier or when you do a product launch, how do you develop a planning capability that incorporates social implications on your supply base? How do you do responsible order planning? That is, I want to not jerk my supplier around. Today I order 100, tomorrow I order 1,000, and I still expect the same delivery time. And I mean, that doesn't make sense. So I need to be very responsible in how I do order planning. How do I do a product launch process? Because if I have a very aggressive launch process, that could put a huge strain on the supply base. And so these are some of the things that what I mean by is internal alignment. But to get that alignment, I also have to be ready to become very transparent, because transparency is one way to create visibility in the organization, visibility in the supply chain. And then we can begin to see, because without transparency, you're really running the whole supply chain blind. So that's what I mean by kind of internal alignment at firm level. And there are companies doing that. So here is a scorecard from Nike. I know it's hard to read, but in the second bottom part, the top part is standard performance measures. In the bottom part, what you're seeing is they've begun to integrate labor issues, health and safety issues, environmental issues in their supplier scorecard about how they measure. And then you have Patagonia on the other end. Patagonia has what is called a four-fold approach, where the sourcing function, the quality function, the social function, the environmental standards all have equal voting power. That is why they call it the four-fold approach. They all make decisions together. So it's not that ensuring social and environmental responsibility is an afterthought. It is actually part of the business decision-making process. So there are companies that are trying to do this and integrating this in their DNA of how they make decisions. So this is internal to the firm. Obviously, when you approach the supplier, as I said, it's not enough just to expect them to do certain things and then monitor them. You need to move towards a commitment approach. Broadly, what I mean by commitment approach, there is different steps identified. It's more of a consultative engagement. You work with them to uncover, analyze, and correct what the root causes of the current issues are. If you're beginning to see excessive overtime, why is the excessive overtime happening? What's going on? So that's a consultative engagement. And once you do that consultative engagement, you have to be willing to sit down with them and do joint problem solving, sharing information. And if you're expecting them to share information, you should share information as well. Build a very trustful and reciprocal relationship. It could also lead to mentoring and coaching, and perhaps diffusion of best practices. If one supplier is doing something great, how do you encourage the supplier to share some of those best practices with others in the supply base? And move towards integrating standards and operational excellence. It could also mean capacity building in your supply base. So we have to do all of this stuff and do it in a continuous improvement fashion and repeat all of these steps. So this is an engagement or commitment approach to work with the supply base, not just an arm's length approach, moving away from that in this kind of embedded relationship. Finally, I would just close with saying, because in these supply bases, the supply could be supplying to multiple buyers. And if a supplier is supplying to multiple buyers, and if each buyer has its own approach to ensuring sustainability, or whether it is environment or social, it becomes a huge headache for the supply base. So therefore, you need to develop some partnership approach to harmonize what you expect from your supply base. And this is, I understand that companies kind of think in terms of, there is competitive issues here and that we cannot collaborate on these things. But there is no competitive or antitrust issues around social responsibility. So harmonizing expectations. So if you have a certain code that you expect, well, let that be harmonized across the entire industry base, and everybody is, the supplier is actually, walking to the same tune of all the buyers together rather than each buyer separately. So that's kind of one approach one could take. So harmonizing expectations. There are initiatives. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition, for example, is the largest trade body for the apparel industry. They're harmonizing all this into developing standard codes for environmental issues, social issues. They've developed something called a Higg Index. So it's all work in progress, but it's happening. And the idea is to harmonize all this stuff. Similarly, if there are 20 buyers in a particular supplier factory, you don't want that supplier factory to get 20 audits with different criteria. So could there be collaborative audits that are going on with information sharing? These are some examples of partnerships. It could be partnership with similar companies in your sector, but it could be also public-private partnership or maybe other sectors, the different ways we talked about in the reverse supply chain. So these are some ideas to think about as we develop social responsibility issues. So this is a more integrative way to think about ensuring social responsibility in global supply chains. Okay, so I'm at the end of my presentation. So hopefully, I've talked about four important areas. The critical role of operations in supply chain in achieving sustainability. I firmly believe that where rubber meets the road, sustainability issues have to be integrated very deeply into the supply chain of an organization. Otherwise, we have no hope of achieving sustainability. Sustainability is an artifact. We have to talk about responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to ensure sustainability? How far does this responsibility extend? Is a question that has to be answered. I have not answered that question in this presentation, but it is an important question that has to be thought through. When we talk about sustainable operations supply chain, I've talked briefly about, I think we can learn a lot about where we have come in our journey with lean, what made lean successful for those companies who have succeeded with lean, what made quality movement successful for the companies that made that successful. I could add one more to that. For example, safety. Safety is not just a safety department's responsibility. Safety becomes everybody's responsibility. I firmly believe that sustainability has to go in that direction. Sustainability is not a CSR issue, not an environmental group within the organization whose focus that is. It has to be embedded, integrated in day-to-day business decision making. And some examples I gave about within firm, upstream, downstream, kind of 3 different ways to segment this stuff. And also think in terms of the human rights and labor standards issue, which broadly is called social responsibility issues. What are some of the deficiencies of the current model? Industries have gone through that, especially apparel industry, footwear industry have gone through the compliance model. They have learned a lot and they're moving into more responsible ways of doing this stuff. Maybe other companies should take a cue and also move in that same direction and not repeat the mistakes of other companies that have gone by. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and close this presentation. And Erica, back to you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anupindi. I really like what you said about quality and safety movement, that it wasn't just part of one department's responsibility, but it's part of everybody's responsibility, just like we are looking at sustainability. And I think supply chain shows a very good picture, like a parallel picture of how that can be viewed. That is responsibility of many stakeholders of that supply chain. So let me start with a few questions for you. You have talked about how lean operations is synergistic with sustainability. Is this always true, or aren't there some practices in the lean operations that could be counter to for example, reducing emissions?
Yeah, one could think about that. For example, I talked about one aspect of lean, which is waste elimination, and but the other idea within lean that could be quite top on people's mind is people think of lean as synonymous with just in time. When you make it synonymous with just in time, I don't want to build inventory. So inventory is a waste. Definitely, we talked about that. But just in time, meaning I'm doing very frequent deliveries to the factory floor from the supply base. Well, if I'm doing very frequent deliveries to the factory, then I'm doing a lot of movement. So in that sense, it might look counter. So, and it probably will be depending on how you're executing GIT. So one way to think about lean is what are the operational practices. I would much rather prefer to think about lean as a management philosophy. As a management philosophy, what it says is that what is the best thing to do given certain constraints? But that's not where we should stop. We should think in terms of how do we eliminate those constraints. So if we say that there is an impact, if I take the perspective that now I use a green lens, for example, so I'm moving my glasses, it's a different lens I'm using. I wish I had a green lens to show you. If I put on a green lens, then I say, well, oh, yes, I need to take environment into account, and therefore I need to rethink about my GIT delivery. Because the trade-off I was making is inventory is a waste. Well, inventory is a waste, all right, but emissions is also a problem issue. And therefore, if I bring emissions criteria also into account, maybe I should think in terms of less frequent deliveries. And to me, that's not necessarily counter to lean if you think of lean as a management philosophy, which is looking at, given the constraints, what's the best thing to do? And the next level is, how do I, in a continuous improvement fashion, try to eliminate those constraints? So on the surface, it might appear to be counter. In fact, most of the popular press will talk about it that way. If you take a management philosophy perspective, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
The other aspect of lean, let me just add, Erica, is when we talk about waste, and one of the important things that I picked up learning about lean is nobody would admit that they're wasteful in what they do. And so the challenge really is we do many things, but we don't know that we are wasteful. So which means waste is not visible. And so one of the management philosophies within lean is visibility. If I make things visible, then waste becomes easy to see. And if it's easy to see, it's human tendency to remove that waste. Then I need the tools and techniques to be able to do the continuous improvement. I see a parallel between visibility in lean philosophy and lean management philosophy and the notion of transparency. Transparency is all about visibility. If I can make things transparent, I begin to see where the problem is.
Okay. And so to that same point of having this visibility, today we have this global supply chain of many companies, like for the companies, they extend beyond their own boundaries. With this context in mind, when the company doesn't control fully the upstream or downstream activities that are typically executed by independent groups, how could this company ensure or even any group ensure sustainability in the extended supply chain with a global context?
It's a very, very important, it's a commonly articulated concern, so it's a good question. And it's an important one to address because obviously most supply chains have become decentralized. There's a lot of outsourcing, etc., going on. So commonly people will say, well, I don't control my supply chain, so how can I expect my supplier to do so? So I would like to kind of offer two things there. One is we need to distinguish between influence and control. I may not have control, but I may have actually influence, right? So I think one needs to think in terms of influence. And influence requires that I engage with my suppliers and have them see my way and do the things that I expect them to do, and hopefully that, ideal situation would be that If I'm a firm, my value system and you as a supplier's value system actually align. And I know there are companies that have done these decisions. I'm not going to name names, but there is a very large, the head of global operations of a very large company basically once told me, it is not in our DNA to do business with these other suppliers. And I was surprised. He says, what does that mean? He says, oh, our values don't match. And they're talking about a multi-billion-dollar sourcing engagement. And you're saying you're making a multi-billion-dollar sourcing decision based on values? I said, of course. Because if values don't match, then how am I going to kind of do business with them? So there is another perspective to think about. So there is a values perspective, there is an influence perspective, because this control is always an argument that many, many companies would make. And therefore, you have to think in terms of how do you influence. I'm always reminded of Dale Carnegie's book about how to influence friends or whatever, make friends and influence people. It's the same idea at the firm level, that I have to think about how I can influence my different stakeholders in my supply chain. So I think this value-based system and influence becomes important, and the values also becomes important in a different context. Ask yourself the following question: what would you have done as a firm if you were completely vertically integrated? And let's peel the layer back from there about what do you expect your suppliers to do.
Okay, so you kind of answer my next two questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. This is good because it's very interrelated.
They're all interrelated questions, right?
Yeah, because when you think about responsibilities, right? Like, what is the boundaries and responsibilities of any given company? And you kind of talk about, it's not necessarily about your control, but influence. So basically, the responsibility of a company's upstream and downstream value chain is not necessarily just about control, but expands to the level of influence that it can reach. And then that adds to the point of transparency, right? Like, you talk that transparency is very important, but what are some of the major challenges when it comes to transparency?
I think one of the basic thing comes in transparency is there is a fear. There is a fear factor that if I become transparent, I'll be taken to task. Taken to task by activists, taken to task by legal, right? Because you knew about it and you still didn't do anything about it, right? So I think that's kind of the fear is there, but I think it can be, I'm not a legal person, so I can't answer that question clearly, but I think there is benefits to being completely transparent, because first of all, this assumption, if you try to hide, the two things going on. So what I've seen is companies will say, let's talk about, how do you think about your sustainability? I talked about sustainability strategy. A lot of companies would say, if the stakeholder demands it, consumer demands, like a fast food company will say, if my consumer demands this, I will do this. Well, part of the thing is whether a consumer demands certain things or not is based on certain assumption that the consumer is making. Every consumer, when we actually open our wallet and buy a product or a service, we are making one fundamental assumption, that everything upstream is being done in some quote-unquote right way. I don't know that. To a fast food company that say, my consumer doesn't necessarily tell me to do this stuff, I said, have you told the consumer that the chicken feed that comes to you is a product of soy, which is deforesting the Amazon? You don't tell the consumer that. If you told the consumer that, then they will make a right decision. So there is a part of it, I think, this transparency really helps in some way, helps in decision making. But the other aspect of transparency simply is that no company can plug all the holes. Think of this building a dike and a lot of these flood control, different kind of holes coming in and water is flooding in. I mean, you can't keep plugging holes, because if you try to protect yourself, somebody will poke a hole. So the best thing is to say, here is as much as I know, and be open about what you don't know, and admit that you're not perfect. And if you do that, what happens is the civil society or the activist, whoever that is, you can leverage their power to find problems for you. And then you say, well, I'm not perfect. You let me know where the problems are. I'll fix it. Mm-hmm. because otherwise you have to build enormous capacity internally to go find problems. If you want to declare yourself to be perfect, you can't be perfect. And if you're not going to be perfect, it's better to be transparent, so that that imperfection is highlighted by somebody else as well. And even the act of transparency, building transparency, highlights for you where the problems are. So I think it's a tricky thing, and people I know hide behind this stuff and are very, very touchy about this stuff, don't want to say everything. Because other arguments people will make is a competitive argument. If I tell everything, then my competitor will steal away things. I think and I see there is different maturity in industry level. Through my advisory committee role, I participate in the Fair Labor Association. I see companies. If you look at the apparel industry, if you look at the footwear industry, they've all started listing down their supplier factories. This didn't happen 10 years ago. They would say it's a competitive advantage. There is no competitive advantage in listing your factory. You have to be able to compete in other ways than simply the fact that you know which factory produces for you. So I think it's a maturity issue that is important. I mean, I will again bring back. I gave the Patagonia example. Patagonia is one of the companies we practice radical transparency. Their entire supply chain is on their website, and they'll admit that our objective is to minimize harm, but we're not perfect. So if you find a problem, tell me, and I'll take action.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Anupindi. Often we do not think about all that it goes behind the production and the development of the goods and services that we purchase. And I hope that this lecture has broadened your understanding of the different impacts of the value chains, and that you get to ask yourself at work and at home, where is this product or service coming from, or where is it going to? And much better, how can I help to improve its supply chain? Thank you. Until the next one.